Hello, this is Black Thought. I'm your host, Dr. Hutchinson, and it is my pleasure to have with us once again Mr. Walter Fields, who is the executive editor and CEO of the North Star News, and you can see what he does on northstarnews.com. Welcome, my brother.
Thank you for having me.
All right, we need to talk about a lot of things. A lot of things have transpired in the 2 weeks since we've talked, and I want to start with where we left off, Syria. You have been against action in Syria. Many have. I'm not a fan of it myself, but the tide seems to have shifted and things seemingly has changed. And it seems like right before the president was going to push the Congress to take a vote, all of a sudden, Russian President Vladimir Putin raised his hand, got an op-ed piece in the New York Times, and now he's gotten Syria to agree to surrender their chemical weapons. They've had some type of written agreement. So my first question to you is to just weigh in on it. And should we be having a sigh of relief at this point?
Well, I don't know if we should have a sigh of relief because Putin is a shrewd operator.
Yes,
And I
sir.
think he played us like a violin on this one. I mean, it's clear that, it wasn't in Russia's best interest to have Syria using chemical weapons. But it's also clear that Putin was smart enough to wait until the last second to intervene. And I think we still should be concerned, given the state of the Russian Federation, that whether or not we can truly trust that they will be responsible monitors of Syria's chemical weapons,
Mm-hmm.
and whether or not they will seize those chemical weapons and have them in their possession. So I think this is why it's important to have the international community involved, to have the United Nations involved, because at least then you can hold some folks honest, including the United States and including Russia, because quite frankly, neither country has clean hands when it comes to playing this game of, international diplomacy.
Well, I agree. But now let me put on my cynic's hat, if I could. There are some who have said that perhaps President Putin and President Obama were really in cahoots on this thing, and this is really what the president, our president, wanted to see happen all along. And he just, first of all, engaged the Congress, and then second of all, Putin jumps up and raises his hand. That's all part of a plot, really not to have this happen at all, and yet let everyone save face. How do you see that?
Well, look, we will never know until both men are well out of office and documents are declassified, and we actually see what happened in terms of the dialogue between the two leaders. It's certainly plausible. The one thing that I would caution is that even if that is the case, it's a very dangerous game that both men are playing. Because given the environment on the ground in some of these countries, if there's any notion that they've been played, if Assad eventually believes that he's been played, we could have an even worse situation on our hand because when he comes back in anger, the death total could rise. In fact, people are still being killed in Syria right now
I
by
agree.
conventional weapons. So the question becomes if they have played this sort of high stakes game of gamesmanship behind the scenes between the two leaders, the question becomes whether or not the Assad government really believes that it's been manipulated. And if it believes that it's manipulated, there's a great chance that they will react in a very vengeful way against not only the rebels, but their own people. And we have to remember that the rebels' hands in this are not clean either. They have been guilty of some egregious and violent acts on their own. So it's a really messy situation, and once again shows why the Middle East is a tinderbox.
I agree, and it's been a tinderbox for some time. Now let me kind of segue to something else because it's interesting to me. We're now, give or take a month or so away from the George Zimmerman verdict. And it seems like the anger and the outrage has left. Matter of fact, many people would accuse African Americans of having a hot temper. And you know what a hot temper does. You get angry for a minute, and then you forget why you were angry and move on and conduct other business. And, to be cynical, and you got to put on both sides of your hat, some of this may be a byproduct of the media cycle. So let me ask you this. Could it be that? Could it be our hot-temperedness? Could it be something else? Could it be a combination of the two? What's your opinion on this?
I think as Americans across the board, we've been sort of anesthetized to violence. Violence is really part of the American culture. And that we see so much of it that we do have this momentary knee jerk reaction when we see these violent episodes. But then it dissipates because I think in our subconscious, we sort of expect this as a norm.
Mm-hmm.
So when you have people killed, as they were at the Navy Yard shooting, when you have people, innocent people, gunned down by police, as the young brother in North Carolina recently was, when you have a Trayvon Martin, there is this sort of visceral reaction and anger. But then I think we bounce back rather quickly because we have seen so much of it that it really comes as no surprise. So we're almost expecting that there's another incident right around the corner.
Exactly.
And I think we've all kind of become fatigued by it, and we don't know how to respond because it's more than just the proliferation of handguns. It's really endemic to American society, and it's a public health crisis. It's almost like a virus. And there have been researchers that are looking into gun violence as sort of a public health issue because it is viral in nature. And I think we've been infected as a society. So you begin to read across the country all of these incidents. I mean, it's Chicago. They're mowing people down like it's not going out of style. Newark, New Jersey, where murders have just taken off in that city. It's happening everywhere. But then again, after we're angry and after the politicians do their press conference and they vent and you have the police director, then you're kind of left with, well, what do we do? And no one is quite sure. And before you can even think about possible steps to remediate the violence, you have another incident.
You're absolutely correct. And one of the things that I've noticed in my own life, when I would leave the country, go somewhere else, watch their television programming, and then come back after 2 or 3 weeks to what we see, the images for the first 2 or 3 days would just jar me because I don't think there's any other place on planet Earth that consumes as much violence and as much filth on a daily basis as we do with a lot of our programming.
Oh, no doubt. Look, I think popular culture is infested with violence. We see it in music videos. We see it in so-called reality TV shows where the contestants are violent towards each other. We see it in video games that are marketed to our children. They're very violent. So we've become a society that has pretty much embraced violence. And it's one of the reasons why I was so opposed to the president suggesting a military strike in Syria, because if our country is using violence as a means to settle disputes, we shouldn't be surprised when average citizens use violence as a means to settle disputes. That's why we have so much road rage in America now, because the first thing people think is that I'll settle this on my own. And you never really know when you're going to put yourself in jeopardy in the public, because at this point in time, you don't know when someone is on the verge of sort of snapping because they're on sort of sensory overload and they're carrying residual anger from things that don't even involve you.
Exactly.
And I think we've just used violence now as sort of that escape hatch.
Exactly. And with that, let me steer the conversation here. I'm sitting here in Memphis, Tennessee. Memphis, Tennessee, where a young man got upset with his mother, lighted the house on fire, and closed off every escape for his mother to leave the burning house. We see what's happening in Chicago. We see what's happening in other places. You're in North Jersey. Describe for us some of the things that are happening so that our listeners can be clear, and our viewers rather, can be clear that what they see locally is happening all over the country.
Oh, we have, some of the same sort of violent incidents. I mean, people need to understand that in northern New Jersey, we are the most densely populated area in the country.
Yes.
So, New Jersey, a state of 8.5 million people, probably 5.5 million live in northern New Jersey. And that's compacted next to New York City, where there are 10 million. So we live in a region of 15, 16 million people. We live on top of each other.
That's right.
And so you're beginning to see the same sort of outbreaks of violence, whether it's young people, gang related, whether it's domestic violence, which is very serious in terms of relationships that have gone sour, or resentments in relationships that have, broken up, or you have the pressures of high unemployment and joblessness and how that's causing people to lose control and then reverting to violent acts. And then you have sort of the unexplainable violence as you described in the incident in Memphis. What would drive, a young man to do that? And part of what's driving this violence is some real mental health issues.
Exactly.
We don't want to talk about mental health in America, but we see it in northern New Jersey. We saw it in the Navy Yard shooting, where you
Exactly.
have someone who had deep mental health issues that were never addressed. We have a generation of young people who I believe are traumatized, almost traumatized to the point of soldiers in a war climate. They are seeing things that human beings aren't supposed to see. Whether it's someone being shot in the head, limbs being blown off, bodies in the street. So we can't expect them to develop normally as adults if they're looking at this horror show that's going on in their neighborhoods. And until we understand where we are as a society, we're going to see more of the craziness like you described in Memphis, because we have yet to really address that.
And on that note, mental health is not a racial thing, but the application of services and how you medicate may be a racial thing. This is an example. You have persons in more affluent communities, in white communities, that have mental health issues, but through insurance, through other means, sometimes that's addressed. But now in our community, we self-medicate. That's what drugs is about. That's what alcohol abuse is about. So from where you sit, do we do a credible enough job of addressing that? And let me add one more piece to it. The church.
Mm.
I think the church is a blessing and a curse in that area. Because I think sometimes we as pastors, and I'm a pastor, will tell people to pray about some issues when they need to get help.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. And I think what you described is very true. I think in the African American community, there is a tendency to avoid professional help because there's a stigma attached to taking yourself to a professional to seek counseling. And I think that the church, unfortunately, often addresses these issues that we confront in a biblical fashion, and suggesting that through the word and through prayer that we can address these issues. And I think by doing that, they sort of give license to this attitude that we don't need to seek professional help. That's what white folks do.
Mm-hmm.
And it's caused us great pain, because when you begin to see all of the attendant problems in our community, that we should be receiving counseling. We should be receiving counseling through churches, quite honestly.
Well, I agree. And that's happening in this area on a limited basis. There's a brother named Bishop William Young who is doing sort of that coupling of mental health and the church together. But that's rare and it's limited because I don't think churches fully understand that piece. And to say this also, I as a pastor am not saying that prayer and that reading the word is not appropriate, but there's a place to which sometimes you need to get medical attention. I'll give an example. There was a person in a church that I served as a staff pastor, and she prayed and she was a faithful member, but she didn't take her meds one day. And so one day she's standing across the street in the pouring rain, not budging, not moving. When we went over to address her, she didn't respond to us. That's because she didn't take her medicine and her mind had snapped. So she needed help. That we prayed for her. We did all of that. But at the end of the day, while we were praying, we had to get her some help.
Exactly. And I think we forget, those of us who are in faith forget that we're living in modern times. And so through the course of human development, We've been blessed with individuals who have acquired skills that help us through these problems,
Exactly.
and it's not going against your faith to seek help. In fact, you can enlarge your faith once your mind is ready and repaired. And too often times we see people like this young man, apparently, the Navy Yards, who should have received help.
Exactly.
uh, we had a similar situation with a young man who attended my alma mater, Morgan State University, a historically black college, who committed an awful murder. And this was a young man who obviously had some mental health issues and never got the help. And I think as a community, we need to begin to address this, because we have a tinderbox situation, particularly with our young people. Our young people are harboring a lot of anger, and rightfully so. They're angry because they've been abused in their communities. They're angry because they've been abused in their homes. They've been abused in school. They're angry because they understand that they are not receiving the same treatment as white peers in other communities, and they have no outlet. So they're harboring all this anger, and the next thing you know, one of two things will happen. Either they will act out in a way such as drugs or joining a gang, or they'll reach the breaking point and act out, and by then it's too late. And
Exactly.
so if we don't begin to wrestle with this issue of our mental health needs, our community is going to be seeing some tragic consequences in the years to come.
Exactly. Which kind of leads me, and we're those of you who are watching, we're working in circles, so to speak, because all these issues are interconnected. That kind of leads me to the role of the black politician. We kind of hinted at the role of the black church. We can go back and visit that. But now, Newark is a black power base in New Jersey. Memphis, black power base in Tennessee. Chicago, black power base in Illinois. We have all these black power bases. We have all these black politicians, but it seems like the issues that beset our communities keep getting worse. So I'm just curious. I have my own critique. I'll probably share it as we talk, but I'm just curious as to how you see the role of the black politician. And let me meddle a little bit here. I read some of your pieces when you started talking about Cory Booker, who's now running for senator of New Jersey. He'll probably get the seat, but the bottom line is Newark has shifted some, but it really hasn't shifted that much. Because as you know, I'm a native New Yorker, so I'm well acquainted with Newark, and some of the same things people were saying in '67 after the riots are some of the same things that people are saying now. So kind of share with us your thoughts on this issue.
Well, I think anybody who we elect, black, white, Latino, Asian, their job is to serve the public. And I think where we often fall short is holding these people accountable. So we now have had decades of African American leadership, particularly in most of our large urban centers. And suffice that it has been challenged because we have had this great economic shift where we've had jobs that have disappeared that have never been replaced. Those jobs, the manufacturing jobs, have gone overseas. You began to see sort of the white population just desert cities overnight. So you have situations like Detroit, a city that's in bankruptcy.
Mm-hmm.
But I think where black leadership fails, I think black leadership fails on a couple of levels. Number one, it fails because it doesn't believe that it can serve its city and the black community at the same time. And it's not a zero sum game. You have politicians who will tell you, well, I'm not the black mayor of such and such city, but you are the mayor and you do represent black constituents. So you should be fully capable of being the mayor as well as meeting the needs of the African American community. And when I hear that from black elected officials, I remind them that, particularly in places like New York and Boston during the wave of European immigrants, Irish elected officials never forgot about their community.
Exactly.
Neither did Italian elected
Nor
officials
Jewish officials.
or Jewish officials. We seem to be the only group that once we're elected, we feel as though we have to abandon our community or abandon our power base, to be truthful. And so I think that's a real problem. And then the other problem, I believe, is that as voters and as citizens and as residents, we too easily grant elected officials celebrity status. They're not celebrities.
Exactly.
We treat them like Hollywood stars. They're not. They're elected to run government. And if they don't do a good job, it's our responsibility to remove them from office. But what we tend to have is sort of this fawning over elected officials. And that has created some real problems
I
to the
agree.
point that we even look the other way when we know folks are corrupt.
I agree.
We've got folks who are in office who we know are corrupt, who have exhibited a pattern of corruption, but we refuse to move on them out of some warped sense of racial solidarity. These folks aren't looking out for us.
Well, I
They,
hate to,
they don't look out for our best interests,
yeah,
so why are we protecting them?
I hate to use him as the poster child, but we saw that in Kwame Kilpatrick in
Yes.
Detroit. And there is a article by the Detroit Free Press, I think it is, that talks about the demise of Detroit. What was interesting and is really instructive for where things are, not only in Detroit but nationally, the old school black politician understood exactly what you said. So a lot of people wanted to put the blame of Detroit at the feet of Coleman Young. But now this is the paper for Detroit, that after they did extensive research, they said three things. They said, first of all, Detroit started fading long before Coleman Young. And you had a bunch of white mayors that helped it to continue to fade. Second thing they said was when Coleman Young took it, he improved it to the point where their bond rating went up, to the point where they could borrow more money. So Coleman Young was actually a blessing. Now, he had some idiosyncrasies, and some of that was caused by the racism that was hurled toward him because he was the first black mayor. But
Yes.
now, when they finished the critique, and I think I need to put a link up for those of you who are watching so you could read this for yourself. When they finished the critique, they looked at especially Kwame Kilpatrick and what he did and some of the choices he made that helped to put Detroit in the position it's in right now, where it's in bankruptcy in essence. So those things are instructive. I think sometimes our leaders feel like being elected is a goal, whereas when you have the white politician, they understand that it's service, and they understand that yes, you get power, but you still have responsibility. But we
Well,
want to be famous.
you're right, and the old school black politician like a Coleman Young or a Tom Bradley in Los Angeles or Harold Washington or Maynard Jackson and Andy Young in Atlanta
Or Harold Ford here in
or Harold
Tennessee.
Ford, what they really understood because they came out of the civil rights movement, Marion Barry included.
Mm-hmm.
What they really understood was that their ascension to power was really built upon the work of others. And
Exactly.
they felt a deep obligation to their community. And when you look at those first line black mayors who were sort of the pioneers, what they really tried to do was bust up, the old boys network in those cities. So you had someone like Harold Washington come in and just challenge, the Democratic machine in Chicago and overcome it. You had Maynard Jackson who used the Atlanta airport as a means to build black wealth and to make sure that black companies would have contracts. So you had these people who understood that they were in a unique position to assist their community. What we have now in the sort of this nouveau black politician are people who honestly believe that they were elected because there's something unique about them. And it really is all about them. And
Mm-hmm.
so they find themselves thinking that they have no responsibility and obligation to the African American community. And lo and behold, what begins to happen is these people end up isolating themselves to the point that they are prone to corruption. They are prone to failure because they have now detached themselves and removed themselves completely from their own constituency, which no other ethnic groups politicians ever did,
Mm-hmm.
because they understood that at any given moment your number could be called. And when your number is called, you want to have troops. That's why, even with all of his personal baggage, Marion Barry is still loved in Washington, D.C.
Exactly.
because people remember Marion as the fighter on the city council, as the fighter in the mayor's office. He changed Washington, D.C. as a city. He took a sleepy government town and really opened it up to the private sector. Washington, D.C. was a different city after Marion Barry served. Atlanta was a different city after Maynard Jackson. Detroit, as you mentioned, Coleman Young, Harold Washington. So what we've lost is sort of the black politician at the mayoral level who sees his role and sees his responsibility as improving the quality of life of not just his city, but his own community.